Dan Nelson is our resident historian, our genealogist, and in today's saga that was situated sometime before 1681, they should have a reality show. We're going to be talking about children, marriage, infidelity, some people getting the better half, some people not. We're talking about money, and we're going to be talking about cows. Great to have you on the show, Dan. How you doing?
Very rainy Saturday.
Oh my gosh, it is. It is really rainy. I was just telling our audience that this was going to start somewhere in the 1681, and it's almost like a reality show set then, huh?
Yeah, we always think that all the things that happen today have never happened before, but they just didn't have People magazine back then to report on it. So you have to dig it up in the court documents.
Well, I'm ready to hear the latest saga. You always dig up some really cool stuff.
All right. Well, just to refresh everybody a little bit, so we had this Herod Long, and she, depending on where we were at in the story, we all felt like, gee, she's a victim or she's a victimizer because she had an abusive husband. She had a partner that was sort of the baby daddy, and then she ended up with a wealthy guy in the end. Meanwhile, she was a very religious member of the Quaker Church. So a lot of stuff going on. So I left it off with the fact that one of her children, the power of DNA, inherited some of her scandalous behaviors. So just to sort of set it up here a little bit, so in 1681, as you mentioned, there was this gal named Abigail Remington, and she married John Richmond, and they had 4 daughters. But something went very wrong because suddenly in 1688, Abigail, as a widow of John Remington, presented an inventory of her dead husband's estate to the court. So John's belongings in this inventory were only worth 46 pounds, which was just enough to buy a few cows. So here she is, widowed, age 36, 4 young daughters to feed, and could have been for real hard times. But fortunately, she had a neighbor that took her under his wing. And this was Herod's son, Henry Gardner. He was 46 years old. He actually did the appraisal on John Remington's estate, so very familiar with Abigail. And he'd been the constable of Kingstown, Rhode Island, and he was an heir to one of Rhode Island's largest landowners, John Porter, who we talked about in previous conversations. That was Herod's third husband. So Henry was pretty much set up for life, except there was one complication. After being married for nearly 2 decades, his wife, Joan, was still childless, and he was heirless. Joan was healthy. She lived a long time, so he couldn't just sort of outwait her to pass away. It might be too late for him to sire an heir. So he could have probably got the marriage annulled. You were allowed to do that back then if you weren't able to produce children. We all know the Henry VIII stories and all that kind of stuff. So it was a big deal to produce those heirs. And we know that Herod herself had obtained 2 separations from her husbands in the past, so it was not unbeknownst to his family to take that route. So he made no attempt at annulment or divorce, but he found another way to sire heirs. And in 1691, Abigail Remington bore an infant son named Henry Gardner. Their second son, Ephraim Gardner, was born in 1693. So in 1694, Henry Gardner was bound over to the court for being charged by Abigail Remington for getting on her body 2 bastard children, basically getting her pregnant. And back then, in the Puritan colonies, which they were not, they were in Rhode Island. So Puritan was Massachusetts, Connecticut to some degree. What would have happened is she would have gotten called into court, demand that the name of her husband be revealed, and then if she was in Massachusetts, she'd have been stripped to the waist and displayed in public for 15 minutes for having borne a child out of wedlock. So basically, the humiliation penalty. And then her second child would have resulted in a whipping or a 10-pound fine. But because Abigail was the mistress of an influential and affluent man, she didn't get hit with the harshest law, which was their adultery and fornication law. So she was called to court, but she got out of it by being sick, and her husband went in there as her attorney and paid her fine in court, and all was good. He didn't face any public humiliation or a lash because wealthy men, they just didn't face that. And so the town said, look, as long as we don't have to support these children, you'll take care of them, we're good with it. So they went along and had 2 more children, so 4 illegitimate children in a row here, all while Mrs. Henry Gardner, Joan, was still alive. So now Henry had his heirs, and Abigail, along with her 4 fatherless Remington daughters, lived a secure life. And as for Henry and Abigail, they married after Joan's death. Abigail outlived Henry, who died in 1744. So they were together for a really long time. And it was interesting how that story all played out. And Joan went along with the program. She never complained to the court or said, gee, this is wrong. My husband's fathering all these children with another woman. I guess she figured, at least she was taken care of versus being cast aside in an annulment or a divorce.
It's interesting stuff. I mean, all this historical knowledge, you know what I'm saying? I mean, like, this is the stuff that you never think really actually happened because there was no Facebook back then. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I watched in the last year that tale on Hulu called The Handmaid's Tale, and it's like that. There's some fact to base these things on. It's not all some writers coming up with pure fiction. So it's pretty crazy stuff.
It's very true, Dan, and I really appreciate your knowledge, and I look forward to your historical stories next week where we can learn more, and I hope you stay dry today in this crazy weather.
Likewise. Thank you.